Good evening, wherever you're listening from tonight, and welcome to the Sleepy History. I'm glad you're here. The sun has slipped below the rooftops now, and somewhere in an ancient town, in a low room with walls of mud brick or rough stone, a hand reaches for a small clay lamp. A little oil, a twist of wick, a careful flame coaxed from the last of the day's embers, and slowly the room comes back into being. The corners soften, the ceiling seems to lower itself around the light. Outside, the streets are emptying, the last footsteps fading, the noise of the day folding itself away. Inside, the quiet work of the evening is only just beginning. If you find comfort in this kind of slow, gentle journey into the distant past, you're very welcome to stay with us. You might consider subscribing to the Sleepy History and leaving a quiet like on this video if it helps you unwind tonight. And if you feel like it, let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from this evening. It is always comforting to imagine all the different rooms in all the different places where someone is settling in to rest along with us. Now, let the noise of your own day begin to loosen, and let us step gently into that ancient room together. For most of human history, the lighting of a lamp was not a small thing. It marked a threshold, a quiet turning point in the day. Beyond the doorway lay the world of markets and temples, of magistrates and merchants, of grand public life that historians would later write about at great length. But here, within these walls, a different kind of world was waking. This was the world that rarely made it into the records, the world of the household after dark when the real business of survival gathered itself around a single point of flame. We tend to remember the ancient past through its monuments. We picture columns and arches, the marble faces of emperors, the vast stone temples that still stand against the sky. Those things were real, and they mattered. But they were never where most people actually lived. Most lives were spent not beneath triumphal arches, but inside modest rooms, much like this one, on floors of packed earth or worn stone beneath low ceilings darkened by years of smoke. And it was in these rooms, not in the halls of power, that the true labour of keeping a life going took place, night after night, largely unseen and almost never praised. There is something worth pausing over here. The grandest history, the kind carved into stone and sung by poets, was made possible only because somewhere behind it, ordinary hands kept the ordinary world alive. Someone had to light the lamp. Someone had to keep the fire from dying. Someone had to fetch the water, grind the grain, mend the cloth, and settle the household into rest. Without that quiet, endless work, no monument would have stood for long, because the people who built and served and ruled would not have survived the night. So as our lamp burns low and steady in that ancient room, warming the air with the faint smell of oil and smoke, a gentle question begins to take shape. What was all this hidden work exactly? Who did it, and how did they do it, in a world without the comforts we so rarely notice today? To answer that, we must look past the lamp itself and out into the shadowed corners of the house it lit, where an entire way of life was quietly being held together. Follow the edge of that lamplight, past the flame itself, and you begin to notice something curious about the way we know the ancient world at all. Almost everything written down in those distant centuries was written by a small number of people, and those people were rarely the ones sweeping the floor or tending the pot. They were officials, poets, philosophers, and priests. They recorded the things they thought were worth remembering, the outcome of a battle, the succession of a ruler, the wording of a law, the fortunes of great families. The steady, essential work that filled most people's days did not seem to them like history at all. It was simply life, too ordinary to mention. And so a strange silence settles over the past. We can often name the general who won a distant war, yet we rarely know who cooked his soldiers' bread, or who wove the cloth they wore, or who kept the lamps burning in the houses they left behind. The more essential the work, the more invisible it tended to become in the written record. What everyone relied on, no one thought to describe. The bread on the table was worth eating, but not, it seemed, worth writing about. This is one of the gentle puzzles of ancient history. The written sources that survive give us a view from above, shaped by the concerns of the powerful and the literate. They do not represent everyone, and they were never meant to. To reach the ordinary household, we have to read against the grain of what was recorded, catching the everyday only in passing mentions, in a line of comedy about a servant, in a complaint about the price of grain, in a stray remark about a wife's weaving. These glimpses are precious, but they are fragments, and the picture we build from them is always, to some degree, incomplete. Where the writing falls silent, though, other things begin to speak. The most patient witnesses to ordinary life are not documents at all, but objects. A worn grinding stone, its surface smoothed by countless mornings of use. A cooking pot blackened by fire. A spindle whorl, small and round, dropped and lost on a floor 2,000 years ago. The soot still clinging to a wall above where a hearth once burned. These things carry no names and tell no stories in words, and yet they hold the shape of a life within them. A single well-used object can reveal what an entire archive left unsaid. Archaeology has become in many ways the quiet historian of the household. Where the poets looked away, the earth kept a record of its own, preserving the tools and rooms and rubbish of daily living. From these remains, carefully studied, we can begin to reconstruct routines that no writer ever bothered to describe. We cannot recover every detail, and we must be honest about how much remains uncertain. But we can catch the outline of the work and sense the hands that did it. There is a kind of tenderness in this. The people who kept these homes alive would never have imagined being remembered. They were not trying to make history. They were simply trying to get through the evening and be ready for the morning. Yet the marks of their care outlasted the marble and the ink, humble and stubborn and real. And once we start to notice that hidden labour, the ancient house stops feeling like an empty ruin. It begins, softly, to fill again with people, each with a place, a task, and a story of their own. So let us fill the house again, gently, and see who might have moved through its rooms as the lamps were lit. It is tempting to picture an ancient home the way we might picture a modern one, a single small family gathered close, a mother and father and a child or two and nothing more. Sometimes it was indeed that simple, but very often an ancient household was something larger and more layered, a small world in itself, holding several kinds of people under one roof, each living a rather different life within the same walls. At the centre usually was the family in the sense we would recognise, those bound by blood and marriage, parents and children, and often grandparents, aunts or unmarried relatives besides. Around them, in many households above the poorest, moved others who belonged to the home in a different way. There were servants, some paid, some bound by obligation. And in a great many ancient societies there were enslaved people, whose labour was owned rather than offered, and whose presence in the home was one of its quietest and hardest truths. We should be careful here, and honest. The shape of a household depended enormously on where and when it stood, on the wealth of the family, and on the customs of the place. A modest farming family in one region might have held no servants at all, everyone working side by side out of sheer necessity. A wealthier household in a great city might have contained many enslaved people, whose days were consumed by the very tasks we're following through this journey. Between those two extremes lay countless variations, and the evidence we have does not let us describe any single arrangement as typical for the whole ancient world. What these people shared, whatever their status, was the daily labour of keeping the home alive, though they shared it unequally. At dawn, the woman of the house might cross the courtyard to inspect the stores. An enslaved girl might pass carrying a heavy water jar while an aging servant kindled the fire nearby. Their hands did overlapping work, and yet their lives were divided by lines that were rarely spoken aloud but always understood. One might sleep on a bed in a private room, another might sleep on a mat near the hearth, ready to rise first and rest last. It would be easy from our distance to flatten all of this into a single story of hardship, or into a comfortable picture of a busy, happy home. Neither would be quite true. Within the same household there could be real affection and real injustice, tenderness and exhaustion, belonging and quiet loneliness, all tangled together in the ordinary passage of the days. A servant might be trusted like family and still hold no freedom of her own. A child of the house and a child of the enslaved might play together in the courtyard, unaware, for a little while, of how differently their lives would unfold. This is why we approach these rooms softly, without rushing to judge the people who lived in them by the standards of a later age. Our aim is simply to see them as they were, many hands, many stations, gathered by circumstance around the same fire and the same walls. Each of them mattered to the survival of the whole, even when their society barely acknowledged it, and even when history left them nameless. And once we hold all of them in mind together, the family and the servant, the enslaved and the free, the young and the old, the house itself begins to feel less like a shelter and more like something living, something that needed all of them, working in turn simply to keep breathing through the night. Picture the house now not as a set of empty rooms, but as something that breathes. We are used to thinking of a home as a fixed object, a shelter that simply exists, standing patiently whether we tend it or not. A modern house can be left alone for days and will wait for us, cool and clean and ready. But an ancient home was not like that at all. It was closer to a living creature, one that had to be fed and warmed and cared for constantly, or it would begin quietly to fail. Consider what happened when the work stopped, even briefly, let the fire go untended, and within hours the hearth grew cold and the evening meal became impossible. Leave the water jars unfilled, and thirst crept in behind every other task. Stop sweeping and the dust, the ash, the small debris of daily living gathered in the corners and spread across the floors. Leave a crack in the wall unmended, and the next rain would find its way inside. A house left to itself did not stay a home for long. It began, gently and steadily, to return to the earth it was made from. This is the quiet truth beneath everything we will explore together. Survival in an ancient household was not a single dramatic act. It was not one great struggle, won or lost. It was a routine, an endless, soft rhythm of small tasks repeated day after day, each one modest on its own, but essential when taken together. The fire fed, the water carried, the grain ground, the floor swept, the cloth mended, the stores watched over. None of it could be finished because none of it stayed done. The very ordinariness of the work was what made it so demanding. There is something almost tender in this way of seeing a home. It means the house depended, every single day, on the care of the people within it. The walls did not hold themselves up. The warmth did not keep itself. Behind the plain surface of an ordinary evening lay a web of quiet effort, largely invisible, that had to be renewed again and again for the household simply to remain what it was. What looked like stillness was actually the result of constant, gentle motion, like the calm surface of water held steady by everything moving beneath it. We should remember too how much of this varied. A wealthier home had more hands to share the labour and more comfort to show for it. A poorer household carried the same burdens with fewer people to bear them and less margin when something went wrong. But rich or poor, in city or countryside, no home escaped the basic truth. A living space required living care, offered without pause, or it would slowly cease to be a home at all. So as our lamp burns on in that ancient room, we begin to understand what its small light really represented. It was not simply illumination. It was a sign that someone was there, tending, keeping, holding the household together against the cold and the dark. And of all the tasks that filled those hands, one came before all the others, older than any wall or written word, the task that made warmth and food and gathering possible in the first place. Before we can understand anything else about the ancient home, we must sit down beside its oldest and most faithful companion and learn what it took to keep the fire alive. There is a particular kind of worry that most of us have never felt, and it lived at the heart of nearly every ancient home. It was the quiet fear of the fire going out. Today, warmth and flame are only a small motion away, a switch, a dial, a click, and heat arrives without thought. But in the ancient world, fire was not something you summoned at will, it was something you kept, and keeping it night after night was one of the oldest and most anxious responsibilities a household carried. To understand why, we have to remember how difficult it was to make fire from nothing. Starting a flame from cold meant patient, tiring work. Striking flint against iron pyrite or another suitable striker to catch a spark. Or using friction between pieces of dry wood to coax out an ember, then nursing that fragile glow with tinder and breath until it caught. On a damp morning with poor materials, this could take a long and frustrating while. It was not impossible, but it was never easy, and no one wanted to begin the day that way if it could be avoided. So the household did something wiser. Rather than letting the fire die each night and rebuilding it each dawn, it kept the fire alive through the darkness. In the evening, the last person awake would bank the hearth, drawing the glowing coals together and covering them carefully, often with a layer of ash. Buried like this, sheltered from drafts, the embers would smoulder slowly through the night, holding their heat in secret. In the morning, that same warm nest of coals could be uncovered, fed with fresh fuel, and gently breathed back into flame. The fire, in a sense, never truly slept. It only rested. In many households, banking the embers became a familiar evening practice. helping the remaining heat survive until morning. The precise method varied by place and circumstance, but where it was practiced, it spared the household the difficulty of beginning again from a cold hearth. A well-banked fire meant a warm, workable morning. Bread could be baked, water heated, the chill driven from the room. A fire allowed to die meant a cold and difficult start, and perhaps a humbling walk to a neighbour's door to borrow a few live coals and carry them carefully home. That small errand, embers cupped and shielded against the wind, was a quiet admission that the household's most basic vigilance had slipped. There is a gentle contrast here worth holding on to. A tended fire asked for so little, just a moment of care at the end of the day, a handful of ash, a watchful eye, and in return it gave nearly everything: heat, light, cooked food, a centre for the household to gather around. Yet the moment it was neglected, that small ease turned instantly into hardship. The difference between comfort and struggle could rest on whether one tired person, at the close of a long day, remembered to bank the coals before lying down to sleep. Perhaps this is why fire was so often treated with something close to reverence, watched over as if it were alive, because in a way it behaved as if it were. It could be born and fed, and it could die, and once dead it did not easily return. To keep it burning was to hold a thread of continuity from one day to the next. An unbroken warmth passed quietly through the hours of darkness. But a fire, however carefully kept, was always hungry. Embers alone could not sustain a household for long. Each morning's revived flame needed something to feed on, and gathering that fuel was a labour all its own, humble, heavy, and endless. So from the glowing heart of the hearth, we follow the daily search for everything that would burn. A fire kept alive through the night still woke hungry in the morning, and there was only one way to satisfy it. Something had to be found to burn, and then found again the next day, and the day after that without end. We rarely think about this now. Fuel for most of us is invisible, arriving through pipes and wires we never see. But in the ancient household, feeding the fire meant real physical gathering, a task that shaped the early hours of countless lives and left almost no trace in the written record at all. What a household burned depended greatly on where it stood. In wooded regions, fuel meant firewood and fallen branches, gathered from the land and dried for the hearth. Elsewhere, wood was precious and scarce, and people relied on charcoal, which burned hotter and cleaner but had to be bought or made. In treeless places, families turned to whatever the landscape offered: dried brushwood, stubble left after harvest, reeds from the riverbanks, and in many farming communities dried animal dung shaped into cakes and set out in the sun until it hardened into a slow, steady fuel. None of this was glamorous. All of it was necessary. The gathering itself was humble, tiring work, and often it fell to those with the least standing in the home, to children, to servants, to the enslaved, and frequently to women, who folded it into the long round of their other tasks. Much of it happened early, in the grey light before the day had fully begun, when the air was cold and the streets of fields were still, a stooped figure moving along a hedgerow breaking off dead wood, a child dragging a bundle of sticks nearly as large as itself, hands roughened by the constant handling of rough bark and dry stalks, gathering, always gathering against tomorrow's need. We should not imagine this was the same everywhere. In the countryside, fuel might be plentiful and close at hand, a matter of effort more than expense. But in the crowded cities, wood could be genuinely costly, hauled in from distant forests and sold in the market like any other good. For the urban poor, keeping warm was not simply a chore, but a real strain on the household's slender means, and a cold winter could press hard on families who could not afford enough to burn. The same flame that comforted the wealthy could be a source of quiet worry for those with little. There is a contrast worth pausing on here. Out in the world stood the great achievements of the age, the temples with their painted columns, the public squares where important men debated and traded and made their names. History remembered those places well, yet none of them could have functioned without this dusty, unremarked labour happening in the shadows behind them, the endless collecting of things that would burn. The magistrate who spoke grandly in the forum returned in the evening to a home warmed by fuel that someone unnamed had risen early to gather. And yet there was a rhythm to it, even a kind of quiet knowledge. Those who gathered fuel learned which wood burned long and which burned fast, how to tell dry from damp where the good brushwood grew and when the dung would be ready. This was skill, though no one called it that, passed hand to hand and season to season. It was not celebrated, but it was real, and the warmth of the whole household rested on it. Once the fuel was gathered and carried home, it fed the flame that made the household's next great labour possible. The fire was not only a source of warmth, it was where the day's food would be prepared and where the household might gather. So from the search for fuel, we return to the hearth that gave it purpose. Come and sit for a moment beside the fire itself, in the place where all that careful tending and gathering finally gathered into meaning. We have followed the flame kept alive through the night and the fuel carried in at dawn, and now we arrive at the hearth, the spot in the home where the fire actually lived. It is easy to think of it as simply a place to cook, a practical corner of the room. But in the ancient household, the hearth was something far greater than that. In many ways, it was the centre of the world. Around this single point of heat, the whole rhythm of the home arranged itself. Here the pot was set to simmer and the bread was baked. Here the family drew close in the cold, faces warmed and lit by the same low glow. In the evening, when the outside world had darkened and quieted, the hearth became the natural gathering place, the one spot where warmth and light still held. Whatever happened in the house tended, sooner or later, to return to the fire. It was where the day began and where it settled toward its close. There is a reason so many memories of home across so many cultures cluster around a fire. Warmth draws people together in a way that few other things do. In the flickering light of the hearth, tasks were shared and stories were told. Children fell asleep against a parent's side, and the ordinary business of being a family unfolded in the small circle the flame could reach. Beyond that circle lay shadow and cold. Within it lay belonging. The hearth marked the difference between simply being under a roof and truly being home. Perhaps this is why, in many ancient societies, the hearth carried a meaning that went beyond the practical altogether. The fire was not only useful, it was, in a quiet way, sacred. In a number of cultures, the household fire was linked to protective spirits or gods of the home, and the flame itself could stand for the family's continuity, its very life. To let the fire die carelessly was in some places not merely inconvenient but faintly unlucky, a bad omen for the household. A small shrine might stand near the hearth, and the fire treated with a respect that blended the everyday and the holy. We should be careful, as always, not to flatten this into a single picture. Beliefs about the hearth differed from place to place and changed across the long centuries, and the evidence we have is uneven and incomplete. Not every household kept a shrine, and not every flame was thought divine. But across a great many ancient cultures, in one form or another, we find this same tender instinct, that the fire at the heart of the home was more than heat, that it held something of the family within it, and that to keep it burning was to keep something precious alive. Hold both of these things together, and you begin to feel the true weight of the hearth. On one side, the plainest practicality, a place to boil beans and warm cold hands. On the other, something close to the soul of the household, a small sacred flame standing for the family itself. In the ancient home, there was no real separation between the two. The same fire that cooked the evening meal was the fire that gathered the family, and perhaps the fire the household prayed beside. The ordinary and the meaningful lived in the very same coals, and this is worth remembering as we go on. When we speak of the labour that kept the fire alive, we're not speaking only of a chore. We're speaking of the care of the household's centre, its warmth, its gathering place, and in many homes its quiet heart. Which raises a gentle question we have not yet asked directly. If the hearth mattered this much, then the person who tended it day after day held something more important than we might first assume. So let us turn now to the keeper of the flame. If the hearth was the heart of the home, then someone had to be at steady pulse, and that someone rarely appears by name in any history. Think back over everything we have followed. The fire banked at night, the embers coaxed awake at dawn, the fuel gathered in the cold hours, the pot set to simmer and the family gathered close. None of it happened on its own. Behind each of these small acts stood a person, tending the flame faithfully through the turning of the days, and in most ancient households, that person was among the least celebrated of all. Who was it in practice? The honest answer is that it varied, and we should resist the urge to make it tidy. In many homes it was a woman, the labour of the hearth falling within the wide sphere of household work that so often rested on her shoulders. In wealthier households, the daily reality of fire-keeping might belong instead to a servant or to an enslaved person. someone who rose before the others and lay down after them. In the poorest homes, where there were few hands to spare, it might simply be whoever was nearest and able. The pattern shifted with class, with custom, with the size and wealth of the family, and the evidence we have gives us glimpses rather than a full account. Whoever they were, their days often began and ended with the fire. To keep the embers alive meant rising first, in the grey chill before dawn, kneeling at the hearth and breathing the coals back into flame while the rest of the household still slept. And it meant being the last to rest, banking the fire again at night, drawing the coals together and covering them with ash, so that tomorrow might begin in warmth rather than struggle. Between those two quiet acts lay the whole of the day, and the fire needed attention through much of it. Fed, watched, coaxed, never entirely left alone. It would be easy to see this only as drudgery, and much of it surely was tiring, humble, unglamorous work. The one who tended the fire was rarely praised for it. Their care was noticed mainly in its absence, when the flame died and the morning turned cold. In the eyes of their society, this was a lowly task, beneath mention, the sort of thing that filled the days of those without power or standing. And yet there is another way to see it, quieter and truer. For in that small and unremarked role lived a real, if unspoken, kind of authority. The keeper of the flame held something the whole household depended upon. Their steady attention was what stood between the family and the cold, between a workable morning and a difficult one. The comfort of everyone in the home, the warmth they took for granted, the meal they expected to find ready, all of it flowed from this one person's faithful care. There was power in that of a sort, even if it came with little freedom and less recognition. We should hold that gentle tension without overstating it. This was not authority in any grand or public sense. The person who tended the fire could not command or decide the household's fate, and their labour was often bound by duty or by bondage rather than freely given. But within the small world of the home, they shaped something essential, day after day through nothing more than reliable, patient care. Quiet agency, hidden inside quiet limitation. Perhaps that is the truest thing we can say about the keeper of the flame, that they held the household's warmth in their hands and were seldom thanked for it, and that this was so ordinary as to be almost invisible, and so important that nothing else could go on without it. It is a pattern we will meet again and again as we move through the home, because warmth, of course, was only one of the household's needs. Beside the fire sat the water jar, and its emptiness spoke of another long labour. From the keeper of the flame we follow the daily journey for water. Beside the warm hearth, in the shadows just past the reach of the firelight, stood a jar that told its own quiet story. It held water, and when it was full the household could breathe easy, and when it was empty a long errand lay ahead. We have spent time now with fire, that faithful, hungry companion of the home. But fire was only half of what a household needed to stay alive. The other half was cooler, heavier, and in its own way even more demanding, for a home simply cannot live without water. Think of how many of the day's tasks depended on it. There was water to drink, of course, for every person and often for the animals too. There was water for cooking, softening the grain, filling the pot, making the daily bread possible. There was water for washing, for the body and for the cloth, and for the floors and vessels of the home. Nearly every act of care within the household reached sooner or later for the water jar, and unlike the fire, which could be kept alive through the night with a little ash and patience, water could not be stretched by cleverness. Once it was used, it was gone, and more had to be found. This is where the great difference between that world and ours begins to show itself. For most of us today, water is the least dramatic thing imaginable. We turn a tap without a thought, and it comes clean and endless at any hour. We would struggle to say where it comes from or how it arrives. In the ancient home, water was nothing so simple. It did not flow to the house on its own. Someone had to go and get it, and then carry it back again and again for as long as the household needed to drink and eat and stay clean, which is to say, forever. Where that water came from depended on the place. Some fortunate towns had wells within reach, or springs nearby, or public fountains fed by the great channels that carried water into the larger cities. A few of the wealthiest homes in certain places and periods had their own water supply close at hand, a luxury most people never knew. For many households without a private well, cistern, or nearby supply, fetching water meant leaving the house, walking to a shared source in the town or beyond it, filling heavy vessels and bearing them home again. We should be careful not to imagine one single arrangement. Access varied enormously with wealth, region, and the age one lived in, and much of the ordinary detail must be reconstructed with care. What did not vary was the sheer relentlessness of the need. A jar of water, however large, held only so much, and a household could work through it faster than we might expect. Cooking, cleaning, drinking, washing, all of it drew from the same supply, and the supply had to be renewed constantly. This was not a task done once and forgotten. It returned with the reliability of hunger and thirst themselves, folding itself into the shape of every single day, quietly shaping the hours around a need that never fully rested. And so the water jar by the hearth was never really full for long. Its slow emptying was a small clock, ticking through the day, and when it ran low, the household knew what it meant. Someone would take up the empty vessel, step out through the doorway, and begin the walk to the well. It was among the most ordinary journeys in the ancient world, and among the most essential. To understand the labour it truly asked, we must set out on that path ourselves, from the threshold of the home to the water's edge and back again. So let us take up the empty jar and step out through this doorway, into the cool morning air, to walk the path that so many walked before us. The journey for water began at the threshold of the home and ended there too, but everything of interest happened in between. It was a walk repeated so often by so many that it wore itself into the very shape of daily life, and yet each household knew its own version of it, shaped by exactly where they lived and how far the water lay. For some, the walk was short and easy, a matter of stepping to a nearby well or a fountain just around the corner, a small errand folded into the morning without much thought. For others, it was long and wearying, a real trek across the town or out beyond its edge to a spring or river, there and back with the day's supply. In a settlement blessed with plentiful water close at hand, fetching it was almost light work. In a place where water lay far off, or where a dry season had lowered the wells, the same task could swallow a good part of the morning and much of one's strength. The distance alone could quietly define how hard a life was to live. Then there was the matter of carrying. An empty jar was one thing, a full one was quite another. Water is heavy, far heavier than we tend to remember until we lift it, and a vessel large enough to be worth the trip could be a real burden to bear home. People learned over generations the best ways to manage it. Some carried the jar balanced upon the head, walking with a steady upright grace that took long practice to master. Others bore it on the hip or the shoulder, or slung vessels from a yoke across the back. However it was done, it demanded strength and balance and a patient endurance, especially over rough or rising ground. Consider what that return walk really asked. Out to the well one went unburdened, the empty jar light in the hand. But home again came the hard part. The vessel now full and heavy, the path perhaps uphill, the footing uneven with stones and ruts. Every step had to be measured, the load kept steady so that none was spilled and wasted. For spilled water meant the whole effort had been for less than nothing. To arrive home with the jar full and the water clean was a small, unspoken accomplishment, repeated so routinely that no one thought to call it one. And yet, for all its weight, there was also a strange comfort woven into this walk. Because it was done so often, along the same streets, past the same doorways and walls, the route became deeply familiar. The body came to know every turn of it, every rough stone underfoot, every place where the path narrowed or dipped. One could walk it half awake in the early light, thoughts drifting elsewhere while the feet found their own way. The very sameness that made it a burden also made it a kind of rest, a stretch of the day that asked for effort but not for decision, a quiet passage between the home and the world. We should not romanticize it. For many, especially those who fetched water day after day for large households, it was genuinely hard labour, and the toll on the body over a lifetime was real. But neither was it only hardship. It was also a walk through the waking town, a chance to feel the morning air, to nod to a neighbour, to move through the streets with a task that had a clear beginning and a clear end. Between the heaviness of the load and the ease of the familiar path lay the true texture of the thing. For the well was not only a source of water, it was a place where people met, where the paths of many households crossed. And so, before we carry our full jar home, let us pause there a while, at the water's edge, where the town quietly gathered. Rest the jar against your hip for a moment at the water's edge, and lift your eyes because the well was never only about the water. Others have come here too from homes scattered across the town. drawn by the same daily need, and in their gathering the place has quietly become something more. The well, the spring, the public fountain, whatever the town possessed, was not merely where water was drawn. For some of those whose lives centered on the home, it could become a familiar place to encounter neighbors beyond their own walls, out under the sky, if only for a little while. We have to remember how enclosed many lives could be. So much of the household's labor kept people within its walls, close to the fire and the loom and the storeroom, the day filled with tasks that rarely reached beyond the doorway. For many, and in a number of ancient societies, especially for women, the world outside was not somewhere they moved through freely or often. Custom and duty and the sheer weight of daily work all drew life inward. The fetching of water was one of the honest, necessary reasons to step out, and so the well became a small opening in an otherwise closed round of days. And in that opening, something human happened. People talked. The ordinary news of a neighborhood passed from one to another around the water, who was ill and who was recovering, whose child had come safely into the world, what the grain had cost in the market, which family was preparing for a wedding or grieving a loss. Small kindnesses were exchanged, and advice, and the simple recognition of familiar faces. In the time it took to fill a vessel and steady it for the walk home, threads of connection were woven that reached quietly from household to household. We should be careful, as ever, not to make this more uniform than it truly was. Who gathered at the water, and how freely they might linger and speak, varied a great deal across places and centuries. In some settings, the well was a lively sociable spot. In others, custom kept even this meeting brief and watchful. Not everyone shared the same freedom there, and the evidence for these small exchanges is thin, caught mostly in passing hints rather than in any full account. Still, across many times and places the sense endures, that the water's edge was where a certain kind of belonging quietly lived. There is a gentle contrast in this worth resting on. So much household work could be solitary, long hours bent over a grinding stone or a loom, or spent watching a fire in a quiet room, with little company but the task itself. The walk to the well broke that solitude open. For a short while, one stood among others who understood exactly the shape of the day, who carried the same jars and knew the same burdens. The loneliness of the enclosed home met, at the water, the warmth of shared company, and then, jars filled, each carried a little of that comfort back within their own walls. Perhaps this is part of why fetching water, for all its weight and effort, was not purely a burden to be resented. It was labour, yes, but it was also connection, and connection nourishes in its own way. Familiarity, companionship, and perhaps friendship could grow around these repeated meetings. Worries might be shared or briefly set down, and the sight of a familiar face could bring its own small relief, even though such ordinary moments were rarely recorded. In a world that offered few such openings, the water's edge gave ordinary people a place to be seen and heard, if only in passing. But the jar could not rest here forever, and the household was waiting. So we lift the full vessel once more, offer our quiet farewells at the water, and turn back toward home. For the water we have carried was far too precious to spend without thought, and once inside the door, a whole other kind of care began, the careful keeping of every hard-won drop. Step back through the doorway now, jar full and shoulders aching, and set the water down in its cool corner of the home. The journey is over, but the care of the water has only just begun. For a household that had walked so far and carried so much to bring the water in, wasting it was almost unthinkable. Every drop had been earned by effort, and so every drop was watched over, stretched and used with a mindfulness that we, turning our easy taps, can scarcely imagine. The water first went into storage, most often in large jars of clay kept in the shadowed, cooler parts of the house. There was quiet skill in this keeping. Some porous clay vessels could help water remain cooler through evaporation, especially in dry conditions, while shade and careful placement offered further protection from the heat. Vessels were placed away from the sun, sometimes sunk partway into the ground, sometimes covered to keep out dust and insects. Keeping water clean and fresh mattered as much as keeping it at all. The stale or fouled water could bring sickness into the home. Then came the careful spending of it. Where water was difficult to obtain, households had good reason to reserve their cleanest supply for drinking and cooking. Water used for washing food or completing another relatively clean task might sometimes be reused for cleaning a floor, rinsing a vessel, or meeting some less delicate need. The precise habits are difficult to reconstruct and would have varied widely, but hard-carried water was unlikely to be discarded without thought while it could still serve a useful purpose. There is a whole way of thinking revealed in this, one shaped by scarcity rather than abundance. Where water arrives endlessly, we barely notice it, and we let it run without a second thought. But where every drop had been carried home on someone's back, water became something to respect, to manage, almost to ration. This was not meanness, it was wisdom, the practical knowledge of people who understood exactly what their comfort cost. To use water carelessly was, in a real sense, to waste the labour of the one who had fetched it. We should remember that this, too, varied with circumstance. A wealthy home with easy access to water could afford to be freer with it. A poor household in a dry place guarded every ladleful. And much of the fine detail of how ordinary people stored and reused their water has come down to us only in fragments, pieced together from the vessels they left behind. But the underlying truth seems steady across many times and places. Water was precious, and it was treated as such. Here, then, is the quiet contrast at the heart of it all. We assume abundance and give water no thought. They lived with scarcity and gave it constant, mindful care. What we spill without noticing they measured drop by drop. And in that measuring lay a kind of dignity, the steady attention of people making the most of hard-won things. With fire kept and water stored, two of the household's great needs were met. Now the home could turn at last to the most demanding daily labour of all, the one that would fill whole mornings with effort, the long work of turning grain into food. Before there was ever bread on the table, there was a sound, low and rhythmic, rising in the early hours from countless ancient homes. It was the sound of stone moving against stone, patient and unhurried, the sound of grain being ground into flour by hand. For most households across the ancient world, this was where the day's food truly began, not with baking or cooking, but with this long, quiet, grinding labour that filled so much of the morning. We rarely stop to think about what stands between a field of grain and a loaf of bread. The grain itself, hard little kernels of wheat or barley, cannot simply be eaten as it is. It must first be broken down, crushed into flour fine enough to be mixed and baked. Today that transformation happens far away and out of sight in an instant. But in the ancient home there was no shortcut. The grain had to be ground by hand on stone, and it was among the most demanding tasks the household knew. The tools were simple and ancient beyond reckoning. In many homes the grinding was done on a quern, a pair of stones, a flat or slightly hollowed lower stone and a smaller upper stone worked over it by hand. Grain was fed a little at a time between them, and the upper stone was pushed back and forth or turned, crushing the kernels into meal that gathered at the edges. It was steady, repetitive work, requiring not great strength in any single motion, but endurance across a long stretch of them, hour after hour, until enough flour had been made for the day. And it was hard on the body in ways the sources let us glimpse only faintly. Kneeling or bending over the stone for long periods, driving the upper stone forward again and again, wore at the back, the shoulders, the knees, the hands. Those who ground grain day after day across years carried the marks of it in their very bones, marks that careful study of ancient remains has since brought quietly back to light. This was not gentle work. It was among the most physically punishing of all the household's daily tasks. And whose task was it? Most often, it seems, it fell to women, and in wealthier or larger households to servants and to the enslaved, whose days could be consumed by the grinding stone. Here again we should be cautious and not universalize. Arrangements differed by region, by class, by household, and much of the ordinary reality must be reconstructed with care. But the broad pattern is clear enough. The grinding was labour assigned to those with the least power to refuse it, and it was labour that never ended because the household needed to eat every single day. There is a striking contrast hidden in all of this. Think of a simple loaf of bread, so plain and ordinary that we hardly notice it. Behind that plainness lay hours of someone's morning, spent bent over stone, arms aching, flour dust settling on skin and hair, the same motion repeated until the meal was ready. What looked like the humblest thing on the table carried within it an enormous weight of quiet human effort. The simplicity of the loaf concealed the labour of the flour, so the morning would pass, and the flour would slowly accumulate, and the grinding sound would eventually fall silent. But the work was not finished, for flour alone is not food. That hard-won meal now had to be turned into something the family could eat, and for that the household returned once more to the fire. From the grinding stone we moved to the warm and ancient miracle of bread. With the flour ground at last and gathered into a bowl, the household stood at the threshold of something quietly wonderful. From this pale, dusty meal, mixed with little more than water and warmth and time, would come the food that sat at the very centre of the ancient table. Across many grain-growing societies of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, bread and other grain foods stood near the centre of everyday diets, serving as some of the most familiar forms of daily nourishment. And making it day after day was a small daily miracle worked by ordinary hands. The making began simply enough. Flour was mixed with water and often with a little salt and worked into a dough. Many households kept back a small portion of dough from the previous day, or used some other means of leavening so that the new dough would rise and soften into something light rather than remaining flat and dense. Then came the kneading, the pressing and folding and turning of the dough, work that took strength in the arms and a feel in the hands for when it was ready. And then the waiting, while the dough rested and rose in the warmth near the hearth, swelling quietly under its cloth. Where the bread was actually baked depended greatly on the household and the place. Some homes had their own small oven, or baked their loaves in the ashes and on the hot stones of the hearth itself. But in many towns and cities, families carried their shaped dough to a communal oven, or bought their bread ready-made from a baker, for a proper oven was costly to build and to fuel, and not every home could keep one. So the same loaf might be born of home-ground flour and home-kneaded dough, yet finished in a shared oven down the street, the household's labour and the wider community's resources meeting in a single golden crust. Wherever bread was baked within or near the household, there came a deeply familiar moment, the smell of the warming loaf drifting through the room or returning with it from the oven. It is one of the oldest and most comforting scents human beings have known, warm and rich and full of promise. That smell meant more than the simple fact of food to come. It meant the long chain of labour had held together, the grain gathered, the water carried, the flour ground, the fire kept, the dough made, all of it arriving at last at this warm and nourishing end. The scent of baking bread was, in a quiet way, the smell of a household that was cared for and alive. We should hold the honest picture, though, and not paint it too golden. Bread varied enormously. The wealthy might eat fine, pale loaves of well-sifted wheat. The poor often ate coarser, darker bread of barley or mixed grains, heavier and rougher on the tongue. In hard seasons, bread might be stretched with whatever was to hand, and in true scarcity there might be too little of it altogether. The centrality of bread meant that its absence was felt as a real and frightening thing. What sustained the household in good times was also what it feared to lose. There is a gentle contrast in the two lives of ancient bread. Out in the public world stood the baker's stalls and the grain markets, bread as commerce, as trade, as something bought and sold and sometimes fought over in times of shortage. And within the home stood the private loaf, born of a family's own labour, baked at their own hearth or carried home warm from the shared oven, eaten together in the low light of evening. The same humble food lived in both worlds, grand and public on one side, intimate and domestic on the other. Yet bread, for all its importance, rarely made a meal on its own. It was the steady foundation, but something was needed to go beside it to soften it and give it savour. And so, from the warm loaf we turned to the pot that simmered patiently over the fire, and to everything the household gathered to put within it. Beside the warm loaf, on the low fire we have tended through all these pages, sat a humble companion that fed the ancient household just as faithfully, the cooking pot, simmering slowly through the day. If bread was the foundation of the meal, then what came from the pot was its warmth and its variety, the soft, savoury something that turned plain bread into a proper supper. And what simmered there tells us a great deal about how ordinary people actually ate. For most households, the pot held simple things, a pottage of grains and pulses perhaps, lentils or beans or peas, slow cooked until soft, vegetables in their season, onions and greens and roots, whatever the garden or the market offered, a little oil, some herbs gathered and dried, a handful of salt if it could be spared. These modest ingredients, given time and gentle heat, became nourishing and satisfying, a warm dish to be scooped up with a piece of bread or eaten from a shared bowl. It was not lavish food, but it was real food, and it kept people going through long working days. Meat, for many, was another matter entirely. We sometimes imagine the ancient table heaped with roasted flesh. But for the ordinary household, this was far from the truth. Meat was often a rarity, a luxury reserved for special occasions, for festivals and feast days, for a religious sacrifice shared among a community, or for the tables of the wealthy who could afford it freely. For most people, meat appeared seldom, and its appearance marked a day as different from the others. The everyday pot was more likely to hold beans than beef, and no one thought this strange. What strikes me most, looking closely, is how much quiet knowledge went into feeding a household well on so little. To make a satisfying meal from humble ingredients day after day through changing seasons and uncertain supplies took real skill. It meant knowing which pulses needed long soaking, which herbs lifted a plain dish, how to make a small amount of oil or salt go far, how to coax flavour and nourishment from what was cheap and available. This was a kind of everyday creativity, unwritten and unpraised, passed from one cook to the next, that history rarely paused to notice at all. And there was patience in it too. The pot was not something to be rushed. It was set over the fire and left to simmer slowly through the hours, tended now and then with a wooden spoon, its contents softening and melding as the day went on. The gentle bubbling of the pot, the rising steam, the smell of onions and herbs mingling with the warmth of the hearth, these were part of the ordinary music of the home. To pass through the room and smell the supper slowly cooking was to feel that the household was in order, that the day was moving as it should. There is a quiet contrast worth holding here. We hear, from the ancient sources, of grand banquets, of the elaborate feasts of the rich, with their many courses and their rare delicacies and their displays of wealth. Those feasts were real, and they impressed the writers who recorded them. But they were the exception, not the rule. Against those glittering tables stood the far more common reality, the modest daily pot, the plain and honest supper of the ordinary home, feeding the many who would never taste such luxury and yet ate most days well enough. To manage this, though, a household could not simply cook whatever it wished each day. The seasons gave generously at times and sparingly at others, and the pot could only hold what the stores allowed. Feeding a family through the whole turning year meant thinking far ahead, saving in the times of plenty against the times of want. And so, from the simmering pot, we turn to the careful, foresighted work of preserving food against the lean months to come. The pot could only ever hold what the household had put by, and this simple truth shaped one of the most quietly important labours of the ancient home. For the seasons did not give evenly. There were times of plenty, when the harvest came in and the gardens bore and food was abundant, and there were times of scarcity, the long lean stretches of winter and early spring, when little grew and the household lived on what it had saved. To survive the second, one had to think ahead during the first. Feeding a family was never only about today. It was always, quietly, about the months still to come. So a great deal of work went into saving food while it lasted. The methods were old and ingenious, worked out over countless generations. Grain, the foundation of it all, was stored carefully in jars and bins and granaries, kept as dry and safe from pests and damp as possible, for spoiled grain could mean disaster. Other foods were preserved in their own ways. Fruits and some vegetables were dried in the sun until they would keep. Fish and meat, when they were had, were salted or smoked or dried against decay. In many places, foods were preserved in oil or in brine or through fermentation, transformed into things that would last where fresh food never could. Each of these methods took knowledge and attention. Drying required the right weather and the right care, lest food mold instead of keeping. Salting and fermenting had their own rules, learned by doing and passed hand to hand. Herbs were gathered at their best and hung to dry for the leaner days. Nothing about this was casual. It was skilled work, and its results had to last for months, so a mistake made in autumn might not reveal itself until the cold heart of winter, when it was far too late to mend. This is what gave the keeping of the stores its quiet weight. The person who managed a household's provisions, judging how much to save and how much to spend, watching over the granary and the storeroom, held a real and serious responsibility. To spend too freely in the season of plenty was to risk hunger before the next harvest came. To hoard too anxiously was to waste food that might spoil unused. Somewhere between the two lay wisdom, the careful reckoning of a whole family's needs against the long, uncertain stretch of the year. A single misjudgment could mean scarcity long before relief arrived. We should picture the storeroom, then, as a place of quiet significance. Cool and dim, its shelves and jars and hanging bundles held the household's safety through the dark months, its buried grain a hedge against famine. To step inside and see the stores well stocked was to feel a certain security, the reassurance that the family could weather what was coming. To see them running low, with winter not yet done, was to feel a very different and colder thing. The storeroom held not just food, but the difference between ease and hardship. There is a gentle contrast at the heart of this work. Scarcity was the great limitation of ancient life, the ever-present possibility that the food might run out, and yet against that limitation, ordinary people set their own quiet agency, the foresight to save, the skill to preserve, the careful judgment to make plenty stretch across want. They could not control the seasons or guarantee the harvest, but they could prepare, and in preparing, they held some measure of their own fate in their hands. This was not power in any grand sense, but it was mastery of a real and vital kind. With the stores laid up and the food secured, the household had met its deepest needs: warmth, water, and daily bread. But there was another labour, just as constant, just as skilled, that clothed the family and filled the quiet hours between. From the storeroom, we turn now to the making and keeping of cloth. There is a small object, humble and easily overlooked, that turns up again and again in the remains of the ancient world, in homes rich and poor, in city and countryside alike. It is the spindle, a slender stick weighted at one end, the simplest of tools. And yet from that simple tool came something the whole household depended upon, just as surely as it depended on fire and bread: thread, the very beginning of all cloth. For before anything could be woven or worn, fibre had to be spun into thread, and that spinning was a labour that quite literally never ended. To understand why, we have to grasp just how much thread a household needed. Everything made of cloth, every garment, every blanket, every sack and cover and wrapping began as thread, and it took an astonishing amount of it. A single piece of cloth required countless lengths of thread laid side by side, and each of those lengths had to be spun by hand, fibre drawn out and twisted into a strong and even strand. The appetite for thread was almost bottomless. No sooner was one batch spun and woven than more was needed, and so the spinning went on, without any true stopping point. The work itself was slow and patient. Raw fibre, most often wool in many regions, or flax made into linen or cotton where it grew, had first to be cleaned and prepared, combed or carded until it was ready. Then came the spinning proper. A little fibre was teased out and attached to the spindle, which was set turning, and as it spun, its weight and motion twisted the fibre into thread, while the spinner's fingers fed out more, controlling the thickness and the tension by feel alone. Wound onto the spindle, the finished thread built up slowly, turn by turn, hour by hour. What is striking about spinning is how it fit itself into the rest of life. Because the spindle was small and portable, and because the work asked for skilled hands but not for a fixed place, spinning could be done almost anywhere, in almost any spare moment. A woman might spin while sitting by the fire in the evening, while resting in the courtyard, while watching over children at their play, while walking even, or talking with a neighbour. It filled the small gaps between other tasks, so that the making of thread became a kind of constant background to daily life, always there, always slowly progressing. And this work fell, across a great many ancient societies, largely to women, so much so that spinning became closely bound up with the very idea of womanhood in the ancient mind. We should be careful, as ever, and not make it absolute. The details differed by place, by class, by period, and much must be reconstructed from fragments. But the association ran deep and wide. The spindle in a woman's hand was one of the most ordinary sights of the ancient world, so ordinary that it appears again and again in their art and their imagination, a quiet emblem of the labour that clothed everyone. Here is the gentle contrast to sit with. A single thread is such a small and slight thing, so easily broken, so easily overlooked. And yet behind every garment lay thousands upon thousands of these slight things, each one spun by hand through patient hours. The plainness of the thread hid the vastness of the labour it represented. To hold a piece of ancient cloth would be to hold, in a sense, weeks of quiet turning of the spindle, gathered at last into something whole. But thread, however much of it was spun, was still only the beginning. On its own it clothed no one. To become cloth, it had to be brought together on the loom, woven strand by strand into fabric. So from the endless spinning of thread, we moved to the loom itself, where the household's patient work took shape at last. With the thread at last spun and wound and ready, the household came to the tool that would turn all that patient labour into something whole. In many ancient homes, the loom was a real presence, not a small implement to be tucked away, but a substantial frame that stood in the room, often upright against a wall, tall enough to work at while standing. It was, in its quiet way, one of the most important objects in the house, for on it the endless thread became cloth, and cloth was what clothed the family and warmed their beds. The weaving itself was an act of patient order. On the upright loom, threads were hung down in long parallel lines, held taut often by small weights tied at their lower ends, and these vertical threads formed the warp, the foundation of the fabric. Through them, crosswise, the weaver passed another thread, the weft, over one warp thread and under the next, back and forth, row upon row. With each pass, and with the weft pressed firmly up against what had gone before, the cloth grew slowly downward or upward, line by line, out of nothing but crossed threads and careful hands. It sounds simple, and in its principle it was, but to do it well took real skill and long practice. The tension had to be kept even, or the cloth would pucker and pull. The passes had to be steady and true, the weft neither too loose nor too tight. And beyond mere plainness, the skilled weaver could work patterns into the cloth, changing the sequence of over and under, or bringing in threads of different colours, so that shapes and designs and borders emerged from the weaving itself. This asked for memory, for counting, for a mind that could hold a design and translate it, thread by thread, into fabric. It was craft of a high order, whatever its makers were called. Above all, weaving asked for time, a great deal of it. This was not quick work. A single garment's worth of cloth could take many days, even weeks of steady effort at the loom, standing, reaching, passing the thread, pressing the rows hour after hour, and that was after all the spinning that had come before it. To clothe a household, then, was the labour not of a day but of much of the year, an ongoing project always somewhere in progress, the loom rarely standing empty for long. What the family wore represented an enormous investment of quiet, sustained effort. Because of this, the sound and sight of weaving became part of the very texture of home. The soft rhythmic motions of the work, the passing of the thread, the pressing of the rows went on in the background of daily life, in the good light of the afternoon, in the company of others at their own tasks. A house with a loom in use was a house at work, and the slow growth of the cloth upon it marked the passage of the days as surely as any clock. It was a quiet music of creation, so constant that no one thought to remark upon it. And here is a contrast worth pausing over. The grand history of the ancient world, the one that fills the written record, is a history of empires and armies, of rulers and great deeds, of things done on a vast scale. But all those emperors and soldiers and citizens, every one of them, wore cloth, and nearly all of that cloth began at looms like this, in ordinary rooms worked by ordinary hands. The mighty world of public affairs rested, quite literally, on the humble, patient labour of the loom. Grand history was clothed by quiet history. Yet cloth, once made through such long effort, was never regarded as a small or trivial thing. It was far too costly in labour for that. In the ancient world, cloth carried a value that went well beyond mere covering, a worth measured in wealth and in respect alike. So from the loom itself, we turn to consider what this hard-won fabric truly meant to the people who made and kept it. Take a finished piece of cloth in your hands, still warm, in a manner of speaking from all the labour poured into it, and you hold something the ancient world regarded very differently than we do. To us, cloth is cheap and plentiful, bought without thought and discarded almost as easily. To them, it was precious, because it cost so much in time and skill to make. Cloth in the ancient world was treated as a thing of real value, sometimes counted among a household's genuine treasures, and often handed down carefully from one generation to the next. Think of what a fine piece of cloth truly represented. Behind it lay the raw fibre, gathered or bought, then cleaned and prepared. Behind it lay the countless hours of spinning, thread drawn out strand by patient strand. Behind it lay the long days at the loom, the careful weaving, perhaps the dyeing in rich and hard-won colours. All of that effort was gathered up and held within the finished fabric. A good garment or a fine woven cloth was, in a very real sense, stored labour, and stored labour was a form of wealth. It could be kept, valued, given, even in some settings exchanged like other goods of worth. and so cloth found its way into the deeper transactions of ancient life. In many societies, textiles formed part of what a bride brought to a marriage. Folded fine cloth counted among the goods that joined two households. Woven pieces were passed down as inheritance mother to daughter, kept in chests and brought out with care. Fine textiles could serve as gifts of real significance, or as goods worth trading over long distances. We should be careful here, as always, for the details varied greatly by region, by wealth, by period, and much survives only in fragments. But across many times and places the pattern holds. Cloth was wealth you could hold in your hands. There is something quietly moving in this, when we remember who made it. The weaver, so often a woman, worked in a world that rarely recorded her name or celebrated her labour. Her days at the loom did not enter the histories. Her skill was not written of by the poets, and yet the cloth she made carried a value everyone recognised. Her worth, in a sense, was woven into the fabric itself, visible to anyone who understood what such work required. She might be invisible to the record, but her craft was not, and those around her knew the difference between clumsy weaving and fine. This is the gentle contrast at the heart of it. The maker was often overlooked, her name unrecorded, her hours unremarked. Yet the thing she made was prized, kept, treasured, even inherited across generations. Social invisibility on one side, visible lasting value on the other. The cloth spoke for the weaver in a language everyone could read, even when the weaver herself was granted no voice in the wider world. In the quality of her work lay a quiet testimony to her skill and her care. Perhaps this is one of the ways ordinary people, and ordinary women in particular, left their mark upon a world that seldom noticed them. Not in monuments or in writing, but in the useful, beautiful, valuable things their hands made, things good enough to be kept and passed on and remembered by the families who used them. A finely woven cloth outlasted the day it was made, and carried something of its maker forward into other hands and other years. But cloth, however precious, did not last forever on its own. It wore thin, it tore, it grew soiled with use, and something so costly could not simply be thrown away when it began to fail. It had to be tended, mended, kept alive as long as possible. So from the value of cloth, we turn to the constant care that preserved it, the washing and the mending that made every precious garment last. Because cloth cost so dearly in labour, no one in the ancient home would dream of casting a garment aside merely because it had begun to wear. A thing that had taken so many hours to spin and weave was far too valuable for that. And so, alongside the making of cloth, there ran another quiet labour, just as constant if less celebrated, the care of what had already been made, the washing and mending and endless coaxing that kept every precious garment in service as long as it could possibly last. Mending was a steady part of household life. A tear was stitched, a thinning place reinforced, a worn edge turned under and secured. Needle and thread were kept close, and a torn garment was not a loss but simply a task, one more small repair among the many. Over time, a well-used garment might carry many mends, patches upon patches, the marks of years of careful keeping. Far from being shameful, this was simply prudent, the sensible tending of something worth tending. A garment might pass through many hands and many repairs before it was finally beyond saving. Washing, too, was its own considerable work, and no small thing in a world without easy water or simple soap. Clothes were carried to the water, to a river, a spring, or a basin filled with hard-fetched water, and there they were soaked and beaten and worked clean, often with the help of natural cleansing agents the household knew how to use. It was heavy, wet, tiring labour, hard on the hands and the back, and it had to be done again and again. Clean cloth, like everything else in the ancient home, did not come without effort. And when at last a garment truly could serve as clothing no longer, worn too thin to mend, too frayed to hold together, even then it was rarely simply discarded. The still good portions might be cut away and repurposed, sewn into something smaller, made into patches for other garments, turned into cloths for cleaning or wrapping or a dozen humbler uses. Nothing was wasted while any usefulness remained. A piece of cloth might live many lives, descending gradually from fine garment to everyday wear to work rag, giving service to the very end. We should picture, then, a household in which cloth was constantly cared for as well as made, garments always somewhere in the cycle of use and washing and repair. This was labour that never truly finished. folded into the ordinary round of days like the tending of the fire or the fetching of water. It asked for patience and skill, an eye for a weakening seam, a hand deft with a needle, a willingness to spend time keeping alive what had already cost so much to create. Here is a contrast that speaks quietly across the centuries. In our own time, cloth is so cheap and plentiful that we throw it away almost without thought, a torn garment simply replaced, an unwanted one discarded. In the ancient home, the opposite was true. Every garment was cherished, mended, washed, reused, and honoured with care for as long as it could give service. Where we see cloth as disposable, they saw it as something to be preserved, and there is a certain grace in that patient, thrifty devotion, a respect for the labour of one's own hands and the hands of others. With this, we have followed the household through its great sustaining labours, the keeping of fire, the carrying of water, the making of food, and the making and keeping of cloth. But a home is more than these tasks alone. It is also rooms to be kept clean, and people to be cared for, and an order to be maintained through all the passing days. So, from the tending of cloth, we turn to the wider tending of the home itself, and the quiet work of keeping order. There is a labour so ordinary, so constant that it slips beneath notice almost entirely, and yet without it no home could remain a home for long. It is the simple work of keeping the house clean, of sweeping back the dust that gathered day after day in every ancient room. We have followed the great sustaining tasks of the household, the fire and the water, the food and the cloth, but threaded through all of them ran this quieter labour, the endless tending of the home's own spaces, the work that kept a dwelling fit to live in at all. To understand why it mattered so much, we have to picture what an ancient home was actually made of. Floors were often of packed earth, or of stone worn smooth by years of feet, surfaces that gave up their own fine dust and held whatever settled upon them. Walls might be of mud brick or rough plaster, and at the centre of it all sat the hearth, giving warmth and food and light, but also giving smoke and ash, a fine grey residue that drifted and settled across everything nearby. A home like this did not stay clean on its own. It was, in a sense, always quietly working against itself, so someone was always sweeping. The broom, often made of bound reeds or twigs, was among the most used tools in the house, drawn again and again across the floors to gather the dust and the ash, the crumbs and the debris of daily living and push it all away. Ash near the hearth had to be cleared. Dust that drifted in from the street or rose from the floor itself had to be swept back. Spills were wiped, corners were tended, the surfaces of daily life were kept as much as possible in order. It was plain, repetitive work asking little skill but constant attention, and it was work that could never truly be finished, which is perhaps its defining quality. To sweep a floor was not to solve a problem once and for all, but to hold back for a little while, something that would return by evening. The dust always came again, the ash gathered again, the debris of living accumulated again with each new day. The one who swept was not building toward completion, but maintaining a fragile order against a constant gentle tide of disorder. Their labour showed not in what was created, but in what was prevented. The slow slide towards grime and neglect held quietly at bay. We should not imagine this the same in every home. In wealthier households, such work fell to servants or to the enslaved, hands assigned to keep the rooms fit for those who lived in them. In humbler homes, it was simply part of the round of tasks that filled a woman's or a family's day. The scale differed, the grandness of the rooms differed, but the basic labour was much the same everywhere. The daily, unremarked tending that kept a lived-in space from decaying into squalor. Here is the quiet contrast worth holding. A well-kept home presented a certain face to the world and to itself, an appearance of order and care, a room swept and tidy in the morning light. But that appearance was not a natural state. It was an achievement, renewed each day by hidden effort. Behind the tidy room stood the ceaseless work of the one who swept, unnoticed precisely because they did their work so well. Order looked effortless, only because someone laboured constantly to make it so. Yet, a home is more than its rooms, more than clean floors and cleared ash. It is also the people within it, and some of those people needed more than order. They needed care. The very young, the old, the sick, all depended on the household not merely to be kept clean, but to be tended and watched over. So from the sweeping of the rooms, we turn to the tending of the people who lived in them. A clean and ordered home was, in the end, only a setting. What truly mattered were the lives it sheltered, and some of those lives needed far more than a swept floor and a warm hearth. The very young, the very old, and the sick could not fully care for themselves, and in the ancient world there were few places for them to turn beyond the household itself. And so, into the round of daily labour wove one of the most tender and demanding tasks of all, the tending of those who could not tend themselves. We should remember how much rested on the home in this. There were no hospitals as we know them, no easy remedies waiting on a shelf, no help a short journey away from most ordinary people. When a child fell ill, when an old parent grew frail, when fever or injury came to the house, it was the household that answered. The sick room was simply a room of the home, and the nurse was whoever within it took up the task. Most often, across many societies, the women of the household, though servants and others shared in it too, with much depending on place and class and circumstance. The care itself drew on knowledge that was rarely written down but carefully kept. There was folk medicine, remedies made from herbs and other simple things, learned by watching and doing and passed quietly from one generation to the next. There were the older, steadier hands that knew how to bring down a fever as best one could, how to soothe a fretful child, how to coax a little food into someone who would not eat, how to keep the sick clean and comfortable. This was real skill, though no one called it that, an inheritance of practical wisdom handed down through the women of a family like any other treasure. But beyond the remedies lay something simpler and harder: presence. To care for the sick meant to be there patiently through the long, slow hours that illness demands. It meant sitting up through the night beside a feverish child, a small lamp burning low, listening to their breathing, offering water and comfort in the dark. It meant tending a dying parent with tenderness even when little could be done, staying near so that no one faced their suffering alone. This was work of the heart as much as the hands, and it could be quietly exhausting, wearing on the body and the spirit alike. We must be honest too that this care unfolded in a world of real fragility. Illness that we would now treat easily could then be grave, and not every sick-room vigil ended in recovery. The evidence we have of ancient domestic care is uneven and incomplete, glimpsed in scattered mentions and in the remedies that survive, but we can sense the shape of it clearly enough. Ordinary people, without our medicines or our certainties, doing what they could for those they loved, offering comfort where a cure was beyond reach. Here lies a gentle contrast that touches something deeply human. Illness and frailty were among the hardest of hardships, bringing fear and pain and sometimes loss into the home. And yet, set against that hardship was the small and steady comfort of loving care, a cool cloth on a hot brow, a familiar voice in the dark, hands that stayed near when they were needed most. The suffering could not always be prevented, but it need not be borne alone, and in the ancient household it rarely was. To tend a home like this, though, both its rooms and its people, someone had to hold the whole together, to know what was needed and when, to manage the stores and the tasks and the many hands. Behind the sweeping and the nursing and all the rest stood a quiet organising presence, the one who kept the household running. So from the care of the vulnerable, we turn to the one who held the keys. Behind every task we have followed, the swept floor and the tended fire, the filled water jar and the guarded stores, there had to be a mind that held them all together. A household of many rooms and many needs did not run itself. Someone had to know what was in the storeroom and what was running low, who was doing which work and what still needed doing, when to spend and when to save. And in many ancient homes, this quiet task of holding the whole together fell to a single person, most often the woman of the house, or a trusted servant who managed in her stead. This was the work of household management, and it was more considerable than we might first assume. To run a home well meant keeping account of its resources, the grain and oil and provisions, the cloth and the tools, everything the family relied upon, and judging how it should all be used across the days and seasons. It meant directing the labour of others where there were others to direct, assigning tasks, overseeing servants or the enslaved, seeing that the many small works of the home were done and done in their proper time. It was organising, deciding, watching over, a steady exercise of judgment that shaped the well-being of everyone within the walls. In some ancient cultures, this responsibility carried a quiet and telling symbol, keys. The one who managed the household held the keys to its storerooms and its chests, to the places where its valuables and provisions were kept safe. To hold the keys was to hold trust and responsibility together, to be the one entrusted with the household stores and thereby with a real measure of its security. It was a small object, but a meaningful one, a plain sign of who truly kept the home. We should be cautious, as always, for such customs varied by place and period and are known to us only in part. But the image is a fitting one, for there was, in this role, a genuine authority, even if it was rarely named as such. The person who held the keys shaped the daily life and comfort of the entire household through their decisions and their care. Whether the family ate well through the winter, whether the work of the home was done in good order, whether its resources were wisely kept, all of this rested to a large degree on their steady hand. Within the walls of the home, theirs was a real and consequential power, quietly exercised day after day in ways that touched everyone. And yet this authority stood, for the most part, outside the record. It was largely unwritten, unremarked by the histories that concerned themselves with public affairs and public men. The one who ran the household did not sit in council or speak in the forum. Her domain was the home, and the home was rarely thought worth chronicling. So her steady management, essential as it was, left little trace in the written past, surviving mostly in hints and in the objects like those keys that spoke of her charge. Here is a contrast that runs to the very heart of ancient life. In the public world, such a person, and especially a woman, might hold little formal power, barred from the offices and the arenas where the recorded history was made. But within the private world of the home, she held real authority, managing resources and people and the whole quiet economy of the household. Limited without, consequential within, her power was no less real for being confined to walls the wider world overlooked. But this authority, real as it was, never existed without limits. It was bounded on every side by law and by custom, by rules that determined who could own what, decide what, and act how within the household and beyond it. To understand the one who held the keys, we must also understand the rules that shaped her world. So from the quiet authority of the home, we turn to the rules that framed the rooms. The authority of the one who held the keys, real as it was within the home, did not exist in open air. It existed within a framework of rules, laws, and customs that reached even into the quietest rooms and set the boundaries of what each person could and could not do. To understand ancient domestic life fully, we have to see these rules, for they shaped the household as surely as its walls did, drawing lines that everyone within understood, whether or not they were ever spoken aloud. These rules varied enormously, and we must resist the urge to describe them as one thing. Across the many ancient societies, and across the long stretch of centuries, the laws and customs governing the household differed greatly. But certain broad patterns recurred. In many places, law determined who could own property and who could not, who held authority over whom within the family, who could make decisions and enter agreements, and who required another to act on their behalf. Legal status, whether one was free or enslaved, man or woman, of this class or that, shaped one's rights and one's place, with a force that could be hard and unyielding. For many people, and for many women in particular, these rules could set real and lasting limits. In a number of ancient societies, a woman's legal standing was bound up with a father or a husband, her ability to own, inherit, or decide constrained by law and custom in ways that a man's was not. The enslaved, of course, faced constraints far harsher still, their very selves held as the property of another. These were the formal edges of a life, the boundaries the law and the custom of the age laid down, and they were real. We should not soften or pretend them away. And yet, here is where we must look more closely, for the law was never the whole of a life. The rules set the edges, but daily existence unfolded in the wide space within those edges, and that space had its own quieter reality. A woman who held little formal legal power might nonetheless run her household with real command, manage its resources, shape its daily order, and hold genuine influence over those around her. The distance between what the law permitted and what a person actually did day to day could be considerable. Life had a way of filling in where the law fell silent. Consider how much of ordinary living the law simply did not touch. It might say who owned the storeroom, but not who truly decided what came out of it each day. It might define a person's formal standing, but not the respect they commanded from a spouse, a child, a household that depended on their skill and judgment. Within relationships, within routines, within the countless small decisions that made up a life, there moved a lived reality that no statute fully captured. The law drew the frame, but the picture within was painted by habit, character, and the quiet negotiations of everyday life. This is the gentle contrast at the heart of it. The law as written against life as lived. The two are not the same, and neither tells the whole story on its own. To look only at the laws is to see a world of rigid limits and formal powers, and to miss the texture of how people actually moved through their days. But to imagine those limits did not matter would be to deny real constraints that shaped real lives. The truth lay in the space between, where formal rule and daily reality met and quietly worked upon each other. There was, though, one more world the household lived within, a world that no law governed and no custom fully explained. Beyond the seen order of rules and rooms lay an unseen order, of gods and spirits, of protection sought and blessings hoped for, tended within the home itself. So, from the rules that shaped the rooms, we turn to the sacred household and the small shrine in the corner. In a quiet corner of many ancient homes, apart from the hearth and the loom and the storeroom, there stood something that served no practical purpose at all, and yet mattered as much as any of them. It was a small shrine, a modest sacred space where the household honoured what lay beyond the reach of its hands, its gods, its guardian spirits, or the ancestors who had gone before. For the ancient home was not only a place of labour, it was also a place of faith, and the tending of that faith was woven quietly into the round of daily life. These household shrines took many forms across the many cultures of the ancient world, and we should be careful not to flatten them into one. In some homes, it might be a small niche in the wall holding little figures of protective gods. In others, a modest altar where offerings could be laid, or a place set aside to honour the spirits of the family's ancestors. What they shared was a purpose: to give the sacred a home within the home, a fixed place where the family could turn toward the powers they believed watched over their lives. The shrine made the divine domestic, near at hand, part of the household itself, and tending it was a daily duty, folded in among the other tasks of the home. A small offering might be laid before the shrine, little food, a portion of the meal, a few grains, some incense, a flower. A brief prayer might be spoken, a gesture of respect made in passing. These were not grand ceremonies, but simple, regular acts, small enough to fit into an ordinary day, repeated so faithfully that they became part of its rhythm. In many households, this care fell, like so much else, to the women, though the whole family shared in the household's faith in various ways, depending on custom and place. What were they seeking in these quiet observances? Protection above all, and blessing. The ancient world was full of uncertainty, of dangers that could not be controlled or foreseen, sickness, misfortune, the failure of a harvest, the loss of a child. Against all this, the household turned to the powers it honoured, asking for safety, for good fortune, for the well-being of the family and the home. The offering at the shrine was a way of caring for the household's fate itself, of doing what could be done to draw protection over the fragile, hard-working world within the walls. There is something quietly moving in this, when we sit with it. Here were people who laboured constantly to keep their homes alive, who knew how much lay beyond their power, and who reached through these small rites for some comfort and some hope in the face of an uncertain future. The shrine in the corner was an admission of vulnerability and an act of care at once, a way of saying that the family and its home were worth protecting, and of asking help in protecting them. We should hold this gently and with respect, remembering how little separated any household from hardship. Here is a contrast worth pausing over. Beyond the home stood the great public temples of the ancient world, grand structures of stone, the settings for splendid ceremonies and the worship of the community at large. Those temples were magnificent, and they mattered. But the faith of daily life did not live only there. It lived too in the small shrine in the corner of the ordinary home, intimate and unremarkable, tended by ordinary hands. The grandeur of the temple and the quiet of the household shrine were two faces of the same, reaching toward the sacred. Yet faith did not stay confined to the shrine. It spilled out into the whole of daily life, into small acts and careful gestures meant to guard the home against the unseen dangers that seemed to press in from every side. So from the shrine in the corner, we turn to the small rituals people wove through their days, seeking safety in an uncertain world. Faith did not stay behind in the corner with the shrine. It came out into the whole of the house, into the doorways and the corners and the quiet places where the family slept, in the form of small rituals and careful customs meant to keep the home safe. For the ancient world was a place of deep uncertainty, and against that uncertainty ordinary people wove countless little acts of protection, gestures so small and so habitual that they became simply part of how one lived. We have to remember how much lay beyond anyone's control. Illness could come without warning and without cure. Misfortune could strike a household from any direction, and its causes were often mysterious, attributed to forces unseen. In such a world, people did not draw the same firm line we might between the practical and the protective. To guard the home meant not only bolting the door and tending the fire, but also observing the small rites that were believed to keep harm away and draw good fortune near. The two kinds of care lived side by side unremarkably. These customs gathered especially around the vulnerable, places and moments of life. The threshold, the boundary between the safe inside and the uncertain world beyond, was often felt to be significant, a place where protective care mattered. So too the hearth, the sacred centre we've already sat beside. And above all, perhaps, the cradle. For a newborn child was among the most fragile and precious things a household held, and the desire to protect it ran deep. Small tokens, amulets, marks, or gestures might be used, according to the beliefs of the place and time, to shield a child or a home or a moment of passage from the dangers that seem to press in. We should be careful here, as always, and honest about how much we do not know. The specific customs varied enormously across the ancient world, from culture to culture and age to age, and much of what ordinary people believed and did survives only in scattered hints, in stray objects, in passing mentions by writers who often did not take such things seriously. We cannot reconstruct these folk practices in full, and we should resist the temptation to make them tidier or more uniform than they were. What we can see, across the fragments, is the widespread human impulse behind them, for beneath the particular customs lay something we can recognize easily enough. These small rituals were a way of finding some sense of safety in a world that offered little of it. When so much lay beyond one's power, the observing of a familiar rite gave a measure of comfort, a feeling that one had done what could be done, that the home and its people were watched over and cared for. To perform the small gesture was to push back, however gently, against helplessness, to answer fear not with despair but with a quiet, hopeful act. And this is the tender contrast at the centre of it. On one side stood the vast unknown, the fears and dangers that no one could master, the sickness and misfortune that might come at any time. On the other stood these modest rituals, offering not real control, perhaps, but real reassurance, a small comfort against a large uncertainty. To guard the home in this way was not only practical labour, it was an act of faith and of hope, a way of caring for those one loved when caring was all one could do. But the home was watched over by more than unseen powers. It was also watched, quite literally, by the living, by neighbours and the wider community, whose eyes and opinions shaped a household's standing in the world. And guarding the family's good name was its own quiet and constant labour. So from the rituals that warded off unseen dangers, we turn to the very seen matter of reputation and the weight of a good name. Beyond the unseen powers the household sought to please, there were watchers far nearer at hand and their gaze was every bit as constant. They were the neighbours, the wider community, the ordinary people among whom a family lived its life. And how a household appeared in their eyes, the reputation it carried, its good name, was something to be tended with real care. For in the ancient world, as in so many times since, what others thought of a family could shape its fortunes for years, and guarding that good name was its own quiet, unending labour. We should understand how much weight reputation could carry. In close communities where families lived among the same neighbours across generations, a household's standing touched a great deal. It could affect who would deal with them, who would trust them, what marriages might be arranged, how the family was regarded in the small daily transactions of life. A good name was a kind of asset, slowly built and easily damaged, and its loss could bring real consequences. So it was not vanity that made households mind their reputation, but a practical understanding of how their world worked. And much unseen effort went into keeping that reputation sound. There was the maintaining of appearances, the well-kept doorway, the tidy front room where visitors might be received, the outward signs that a household was orderly and respectable. There was hospitality, the welcoming of guests with proper courtesy and generosity, For how a family treated those who came to its door spoke to its character in the eyes of the community. There was the careful conduct of the household's members, whose behaviour reflected upon the whole. All of this was work, quiet and constant, the labour of presenting a good face to the world. Much of this labour, like so much else, fell within the sphere of the household's women, whose management of the home extended naturally to its reputation. The well-run house, the graciously received guest, the ordered and respectable appearance, these were signs of a household kept well, and keeping them was a real and demanding task. It required attention, judgment, and effort, all directed towards something that produced no food and wove no cloth, yet mattered greatly to the family's place in the world. We should be careful, as always, to remember how much this varied with class and custom and time, and how differently it might weigh on the wealthy and the poor. But here is the quieter truth beneath the tended appearances. The calm, respectable face a household showed to its neighbours was not always the whole of what lay within. Behind it could lie real effort, and sometimes real strain, worries kept private, hardships borne out of sight, the ordinary difficulties of any family managed carefully so as not to show. Maintaining a good name meant, in part, keeping certain troubles within the walls, presenting steadiness to the world whatever the reality inside. There was labour in that concealment too, and sometimes a quiet loneliness. This is the contrast at the heart of reputation, the public appearance and the private reality, the face shown outward and the effort behind it. A household might seem to its neighbours serene and well-ordered, and that appearance might be genuine in part and carefully maintained in part. The work of holding the two together, of keeping the good name intact while managing whatever lay beneath, was among the subtler labours of the home, unrecorded and unremarked, yet real. Yet all of this, the faith and the ritual, the reputation and the care, served finally something larger than any single day or any single life. The household was kept not only for those who lived in it now, but for those who would come after. Its skills, its standing, its very continuance were meant to be passed on. So from the weight of a good name, we turn to the deeper purpose it served, the passing of the household on to the generations still to come. All the labour we have followed, the tending and the keeping, the making and the guarding, pointed finally beyond itself, towards something larger than any single day. For a household was never meant only for the present. It was held in a quiet sense in trust, kept alive not just for those who lived in it now, but for those who would come after them. And so among the deepest of its purposes was this, to pass itself on, whole and living, to the next generation. What was passed on was more than property, though property mattered. It was knowledge, skill, the whole store of practical wisdom that kept a home alive. All the labours we have traced had to be learned, and they were learned not from books but from watching, from doing, from the patient guidance of older hands, how to bank the fire, how to judge the stores, how to spin and even thread, how to grind and bake and mend and heal. All of this was carried in living memory and handed down by teaching. The household's very ability to survive depended on this quiet transmission, generation after generation. Picture how it happened, in the ordinary course of days, a child watching an older woman at the loom, then given a little wool to try. A young one sent to fetch water, learning the path and the balance of the jar by walking it. Her daughter beside her mother at the grinding stone, or by the hearth, or at the sick bed, absorbing through repetition what no one thought to put into words. In teaching a child these things, an older generation was doing something more than passing time. It was ensuring that the home would go on after them, that the skills that kept it alive would not die when they did. And along with the skills went the tools and the standing and the memory. The loom and the grinding stone, the jars and the keys might pass from older hands to younger, worn smooth by use and heavy with association. The family's good name, so carefully kept, was handed forward too, a reputation to be inherited and upheld. Even the household's faith, its shrine and its small rituals passed down as part of what it meant to belong to this family, in this home. The whole of the household, material and immaterial alike, moved slowly across the generations. We should hold this, as always, with due care for how it varied. Who inherited what and how skills and property passed down differed greatly across the ancient world by custom, by law, by class and circumstance, and much of the ordinary detail is lost to us. But the underlying truth seems steady enough, that households looked beyond themselves, that the labour of one generation was meant in part to serve the next, and that in teaching and handing down, ordinary people reached past their own brief lives towards something more enduring. Here is a gentle contrast worth sitting with as this chapter closes. A single life is a fleeting thing, brief and easily forgotten, especially the lives of those the histories never recorded. And yet the knowledge such people carried, the skills of the home passed carefully from hand to hand, endured far beyond any one of them. The individual passed, but the household knowledge lived on, carried forward by each generation into the next. In this quiet way, ordinary people achieved a kind of continuity, a small immortality of skill and care, even as their names were lost. And so we come, at last, back toward where we began. We have followed the household through all its labours, from the lighting of the lamp to the passing on of everything those labours sustained. Now the long day draws toward its close, as every day did, and the home prepares once more for rest. From the passing of the household on, we return to the evening and the last quiet tasks before sleep. And so, the long day, which began with a lamp being lit, comes at last toward its close, as every day did in the ancient home. The light beyond the doorway has faded again. The streets have emptied once more. The household that woke before dawn now turns slowly toward rest. But even the ending of the day had its work and its own last quiet tasks, done softly in the gathering dark before anyone could lie down to sleep. The fire was seen to first, as it had been at the very beginning of our journey. The coals were drawn together and banked with ash, covered and sheltered so that their warmth might survive the night and greet the morning, sparing the household the hard labour of starting cold. It was the same small ritual we began with, performed now at the day's other end, closing the circle. The keeper of the flame knelt once more at the hearth, tending the embers into their long night's rest. Then the other things were set in order for the morning. The vessels were stored, the water jar checked, the tools of the day put in their places. The floor might be given a last sweep, the ash cleared, the room made ready to begin again. Food set by for the next day was seen to. Whatever needed covering was covered, whatever needed securing was secured. These were small acts, done half in shadow by the low light of the failing lamp, but they mattered, for tomorrow would ask the same of the household as today had, and a home left ready was a home that woke more gently. There is something worth noticing in the shape of all this. The household's labour did not truly end with the evening, it only paused. The fire was not extinguished but banked, waiting. The tasks were not finished but set aside to be taken up again at dawn. For the work of keeping a home alive was cyclical, a wheel that turned without ever stopping, each day flowing into the next in an unbroken round. The evening was not a conclusion but a resting point, a breath drawn before the wheel turned once more. And yet, within that ceaseless round, the evening did bring its own small peace. The great labours of the day were done, the family had been fed, the home kept, the fire secured. Whatever tomorrow would demand, tonight there was nothing more that needed doing. In the last light of the dimming lamp, the rooms grew still, the sounds of work fell away, and the household settled, at last, into quiet. The deepening dusk gathered around the home like a soft cover drawn over the day. Here, gently, is the contrast that has run beneath this whole journey. The labour of the ancient home was endless, returning with every dawn, a wheel that never truly rested. And yet, against that endlessness, the evening offered its small and genuine peace, a pause, a stillness, a few quiet hours of rest before it all began again. The work was ceaseless, but rest still came, night after night, as reliable in its way as the labour itself. So the household grows quiet now, its tasks laid down, its fire banked low and glowing. And in this stillness, before we too let the day go, there is a moment to pause and to consider what all of it has meant, all this hidden work we have followed from dawn to dusk. From the last tasks of the evening we turn, softly, to reflect on the quiet dignity of the labour that kept these homes alive. Now that the household lies quiet, its fire banked and its tasks laid down, let us pause in the stillness and consider what we have really been watching all this while. We began with a single lamp lit at dusk, and from that small flame we followed the hidden work of the ancient home through our whole turning day. And what we have seen, in the end, is this: that ordinary homes and ordinary lives were kept alive not by anything grand, but by quiet, endless, largely unnoticed labour, given faithfully, day after day, by hands that history rarely troubled to remember. Think back over all of it. The fire tended through the night, The water carried home on aching shoulders. The grain ground into flour through long mornings, the bread baked, the pots set to simmer. The threads spun and the cloth woven and the garments mended. The rooms swept, the sick nursed, the stores kept, the good name guarded, the small shrine honoured, the skills passed on. None of it made the histories. Almost none of it was written down. And yet all of it, taken together, was what held the ancient world in place. The true foundation beneath every monument and every recorded deed. We should sit for a moment with who did this work. So often it was women and servants and the enslaved, those with the least power and the least voice, whose labour filled the days and whose names have almost entirely vanished. They were not celebrated in their own time, and they were not remembered after it. But their care was real, and it was constant, and the whole fragile world of the household rested upon it. Without them, quite simply, the homes would have grown cold and dark and empty, and the grand history above would have had nothing to stand on. And here is what I hope we might carry away softly into the night. There is a deep and lasting dignity in this hidden work, not the loud dignity of great achievements, but the quiet dignity of faithful care, of ordinary people holding their small worlds together with patience and skill and love. The one who banked the fire, who carried the water, who ground the grain and nursed the child, was doing something that mattered profoundly, whether or not anyone ever said so. Their labour was humble, but it was not small. We should not sentimentalize it, and we have tried not to. Much of this work was hard, and much of it was borne by people who had little choice in the matter, and the world that assigned it to them was often unjust. All of that is true, and we hold it honestly, but it does not diminish the dignity of the work itself, or of those who did it. If anything, it deepens it, that people bore such labour, under such constraints, and still kept their homes and families alive with such steady care. We should sit for a moment with who did this work. So often it was women and servants and the enslaved, those with the least power and the least voice, whose labour filled the days and whose names have almost entirely vanished. They were not celebrated in their own time, and they were not remembered after it. Here, then, is the last gentle contrast of our journey. Grand history remembered the rulers and the wars, the things carved in stone and sung in verse. But the quiet history of the home, the labour that actually sustained human life, went largely unrecorded, its dignity unwritten. Time forgot to write it down. And yet it was never truly erased, for its marks remain in the worn tools and the old rooms, and in this simple truth we can still recognise, that ordinary care, faithfully given, is among the most enduring things human beings have ever done. And with that thought to rest upon, we turn now, softly, from the ancient home back toward your own, and toward the quiet of your own night. The lamp in that ancient room is fading now, its oil nearly spent, its small flame growing soft and low. Let it fade, its work is done, and so is ours. We have followed a whole day through that distant home, from the first light of the lamp to the last banking of the fire, and now it is time gently to let it all go, and to return from that far-off place to the quiet room where you are resting tonight. Think, for just a moment longer, of how far back this quiet goes. Across thousands of years and in countless homes and many different lands, there have been hands like the ones we followed, tending fires, carrying water, preparing food, and caring for those around them. Night after night, for as long as there have been homes at all, someone has done the quiet work of holding a small world together, and then, at last, laid it down to rest. But their care was real, and it was constant, and the whole fragile world of the household rested upon it. Without them, quite simply, the homes would have grown cold and dark and empty, and the grand history above would have had nothing to stand on. And here is what I hope we might carry away softly into the night. You are the newest part of a very old and gentle story, and now the work of your own day is done too. Whatever it asked of you, however heavy or light it was, it is finished now, and there is nothing more that needs doing tonight. Like that ancient household with its fire banked low, you can let the tasks be set aside until morning. This is your resting point, your pause in the turning of the days, and you have earned the quiet of it. So let your body grow heavy and still. Let your breathing slow and soften, like a flame settling into embers. There is nothing to carry now, nothing to tend, nothing to keep watch over. The home is quiet. The lamp is nearly out. The long day has come at last to its gentle close, and all that is left for you to do is rest. Sleep well, and may the quiet stay with you through the night. There is a deep and lasting dignity in this hidden work, not the loud dignity of great achievements, but the quiet dignity of faithful care, of ordinary people holding their small worlds together with patience and skill and love. The one who banked the fire, who carried the water, who ground the grain and nursed the child, was doing something that mattered profoundly, whether or not anyone ever said so. Their labour was humble, but it was not small. We should not sentimentalize it, and we have tried not to. Much of this work was hard, and much of it was borne by people who had little choice in the matter, and the world that assigned it to them was often unjust. All of that is true, and we hold it honestly, but it does not diminish the dignity of the work itself, or of those who did it. If anything, it deepens it, that people bore such labour, under such constraints, and still kept their homes and families alive with such steady care.